So second semester, we've now wrapped up standards 1 through 13 in the first semester. Here in the second semester, we are starting standards 14 through 23. And we're starting off, standard 14 is the imperialism standard. It's the idea that we mentioned with Manifest Destiny of expanding from sea to shining sea, so from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and saying, well, we've now connected that in the United States, so what's next? And so the gaze turns globally, and many European nations were already colonizing and taking over other nations globally, specifically in the continent of Africa and the continent of Asia. And so the United States is like, well, let's look into that. Let's not get left behind here. We want to be competitive as a world power, and we don't want to just be satisfied, was the general mindset. Now, albeit controversial, because any nation that would be taken over and their raw materials being used, there was already people there, and they were in many cases already sovereign nations, and so it was controversial, but that was the approach. So what happens as far as where we start off is we mentioned the purchase of Alaska from Russia, and so that was kind of a first step, and then we mentioned the annexation of Hawaii. So that was kind of another step, and that was strategic both for our Navy, and so from a military perspective as well as from a business perspective, where now those fruit plantations and sugar plantations, they didn't have to pay that tariff to bring their goods back into the United States. So that was our initial focus, and then it kind of hones in the standard on the Spanish-American War. So Spain controlled the island of Cuba, and the United States did not like the fact that there was a European power right here, 90 miles off our coast. And so the United States promises to liberate the Cubans. So basically saying, look, I know you've already tried to rebel against Spain and not been successful, but with our help, you can get there. And so there's some, debate about the USS Maine and whether or not that was some shot down, sunk by Spain, or there was a boiler room malfunction. There's some controversy there about how that happened, but that is a big spark for the war. And then the Delome letter, where it more or less calls out President McKinley as not being an effective leader. So there was definitely some fuel to that fire. But the idea was still there, that this is an area that we can expand very close to our borders. And so the United States ends up and through, we talked about the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt, and going in and it being a very quick war, and that the United States is able to liberate the Cubans from Spanish control, and that leads to some concessions by Spain. So the United States during this time period, we mentioned, get Alaska, Hawaii. They don't gain control of Cuba, but there's a heavy American influence in Cuba at the time. Puerto Rico is gained, and then there's the other side of the war that is in the Southeast Asia, so the Pacific side of the war. So we have Guam and the Philippines that are also gained because they were under Spanish control, and so it was a concession. Now the Philippines, the Filipino people did not like the fact that they're just going from one European power to the United States now controlling them. So there was a rebellion, and so there's a Philippine-American War during this time where the United States wins pretty decisively, and so the United States remains in control of the Philippines really all the way up till right at World War II. So it was a long stretch of time where the United States controlled those islands, but the idea was we're expanding, and so it all falls under imperialism. Then the other part of the standard, it focuses on the Roosevelt Corollary, to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, what this says, if you remember the Monroe Doctrine, we broke it down as, you stay over there in Europe, we'll stay over here, so you don't get involved in our affairs, we won't get involved in yours, you just stay out of the Western Hemisphere. That was our idea of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, Roosevelt is taking it a step further and kind of adding the teeth to the Monroe Doctrine to say, whatever you try in the Western Hemisphere, we will, do our best to negotiate with you But if you try to come over and the negotiations don't work, then we will use military force to keep you out. So, any debt that you need to settle with these Central American or South American nations, you can come through us. We'll sort of be the mediator of that. So the phrase "speak softly and carry a big stick" comes into existence by Teddy Roosevelt to say "speak softly," meaning we're going to try to negotiate. We're not going to yell and scream and rant. We're going to do the best we can to have a civil discussion with you. But if that doesn't work out, if our negotiations fall through, then we're going to carry a big stick, meaning we're going to use our military to enforce the protection of the Western Hemisphere. So we more or less become a police, the policeman of the Western Hemisphere.